So today, before getting into the main topic for today, let me just give you a brief introduction into monopolistic competition. So that was the market structure that was left, right? We talked about perfect competition, we talked about monopoly. The third one is monopolistic competition. So as the very name suggests, you can see that this is a combination of monopoly and competition. So this draws inspiration, this market structure or this industry structure draws inspiration from monopoly and from perfect competition, and in other words you can say it is basically a combination of the two. Okay? So what are the features of monopolistic competition? In monopolistic competition you have finite number of buyers and sellers, and usually the number of sellers is less or limited than the number of buyers. So you have countable finite numbers of number of buyers and sellers, but usually the number of sellers is less than the number of buyers. Buyers are more in number. Okay? The second feature of the market is that these markets are geographically localized. The third feature, and I am not writing on the board because those guys cannot see, the third feature in monopolistic competition is non-homogeneous product. Non-homogeneous or non-standardized product. What do I mean by that? A non-homogeneous or non-standardized product means that those products are differentiated. That means every seller is not selling an identical product. Each seller is trying to differentiate his or her product in a certain way. Okay? So they do not have the same product. They may be operating in the same industry, they may be physically selling the same product, but that product is different in some way. So what am I basically trying to say? Let's say in your healthcare field, you have 5 hospitals, right? They are all competing with each other. They are all providing the same service, that is medical care, but in some way the medical care that is delivered by these hospitals are different in some way. Okay? And these differences can come from 3 different sources. Okay? The differentiation can be first created by branding. Okay?
Can you write for us on the board?
I will.
Okay.
Let them come because they also need the board, so then now they cannot see. Okay, in any case, let me put it down. Okay, so the third feature is differentiated or non-homogeneous product. Okay. And like I said, this differentiation in the product or the service can come from 3 different sources. The first one is branding. Okay. So let's say you have a product, the same product, like I said, medical care, provided by Mercy Hospital in Springfield and also provided by Cox Hospital in Springfield. So they are providing exactly the same care, you are getting the same surgery done, but in one case you are going to the brand Mercy, to the chain Mercy, to the other one you are going to Cox, right? In that sense they are differentiated. They are not under the same brand name. Similarly, you can see this more in case of, other products, for example, gas, right? When you buy gas, you are buying the same gas, but you can buy it from Shell or you can buy it from Chevron or you can buy it from some other company. They are differentiated by the brand. You can buy salt, it's the same standardized product in that sense. Physically, it's the same product, but you can buy Great Value or you can buy Morton or you can buy something else, right? So one way of differentiating the product is by brand. The second way of differentiating the product is by advertising. Okay. So one product may be more advertised than the other product. It may be a more popular or a famous product than the other one. Okay. Can you think of an example here in terms of advertising? Where products, it's the same product, but one is different from the other because one is more popular than the other one.
Generic Nike name brand drugs.
How about different kinds of insurance, like Geico versus, you have the little green chameleons?
That I think will be more under branding. For example, if you think about insurances, you want to buy your insurance from a certain person because that's a big brand name. Do you see what I'm saying? But what about advertising? Do you think there are certain products which are more advertised than the other, not necessarily better than something else, but they just get more sold and they have a bigger market share because it's the more famous product, it's the more popular product? Can you think of something like that? So, like I was talking about, so if you just consider, say, one chemical composition, some composition for a medicine, right, and different brands are making that medicine, then that medicine is differentiated among the branded ones based on branding. Okay? But if you consider, like Faith said, if you consider a generic medicine and if you consider a branded medicine, then probably a branded medicine could be more advertised in the market than a generic one. That is possible. Okay? So that would be under advertising. Could you think of anything else? A product which is sold more, which is more famous because it's more advertised?
Soda? What? It's hard to differentiate branding and advertising.
Correct. That is true. There's an overlap. For example, some people want to drink Coke, whereas there are other colas available, right? And I want to drink Coke because Coke is a certain brand name and I'm affiliated or I'm a patron of that particular brand. So I don't care, I'm drinking that same cola drink, but for me, I'm only a Coke drinker because that brand name Coke matters to me, right? Now, if you consider that entire soda market, there may be a host of different sodas that are available in the market, but if you look at the TV commercials, it is probably the bigger sellers who are able to advertise their product more, like Pepsi or Coke or Dr. Pepper. Those are the ones who are able to advertise their product more. So can you see that as far as we are talking about advertising, it's likely to be the larger sellers who can differentiate their product by advertising, right? And when I say larger seller, I mean a seller who has more resources, okay? And those resources could be in terms of manpower. That means it may be a company which employs more people, okay? Or it may be a company which produces more goods, okay? So it's a larger seller. Can you not see, Steve?
Oh, no, it's the same thing.
You can? Okay. And the last way of differentiating the product is through location. The last way for differentiating a product is through location, which means, let's say, we are considering that same local market. Like I said, the markets are geographically localized. So let's say it is being sold within Springfield, but a product is being sold in the proper city area of Springfield, that is inner city of Springfield, whereas it is being sold in the suburbs of Springfield. So you have a hospital located in downtown Springfield, and you have another hospital located at, let's say, Nixa, okay, which is in the suburbs. So there will be differentiation in the product based on location. Now I want to remind you, don't get me wrong, that when I say it is a non-homogeneous product, I am not comparing between medicines and shoes. I am not comparing between soda and salt, okay. The product is physically the same, but that physical product is differentiated based on either the brand name, or how much it is advertised in the market, or which part of the market it is catering to, where it is located, where the business is located, where the maximum consumers come from, okay. So that is about product differentiation. And the fourth feature, these guys can see, right? Yeah. The fourth feature of the monopolistic competition market is once again relatively free entry and exit of sellers. So it is not as free as perfect competition, but it is not as restricted as monopoly. Okay? So sellers can still come in and go out in the long run from the market, but it is not as free as perfect competition. That means there are some costs that are attached to entering the market and some costs of leaving the market, but overall it is still possible. Okay? Unlike monopoly, where it was totally restrictive, the monopolist would stop somebody from coming out and he himself would not want to leave the market. Is that clear? Okay. Another feature which I did not mention yesterday, that is in competition, when you have a perfect competition, usually all the consumers, all the buyers have perfect information about their seller. So there is symmetrical information when you have competition. Please write that down with your notes in perfect competition. Yes, I will. Under perfect competition, which we covered yesterday, all buyers or consumers have complete information or symmetrical information. What do I mean by that? That means the buyers know exactly what the sellers are selling and they know exactly at what price the good will be sold. Because if you think about perfect competition, what did we say yesterday? We said the good is standardized, right? It is homogeneous. So there is no surprise or nothing hidden about the quality of the product or the nature of the product, because every seller is selling the same product, right? So the buyer has no surprises about the product. And secondly, also because of a standardized product and also because of there are so many sellers in the market, the good is going to be sold at one single price. Remember, P bar? So the buyer also does not have any surprise about the price. The buyers know exactly what good will be sold, what is going to be the quality of that good, and at what price that good is going to be sold. So there is complete information about the good with the buyers. Okay? But in monopolistic competition, that's the next feature. In case of monopolistic competition, there is incomplete information with the buyers. Incomplete information. That means I am the buyer of a good and I buy that good because it is of a certain brand, or I buy that good because that product is more advertised. Okay, so I have heard about that product, or I buy that product because it's easily available to me because of its location, but I do not know exactly whether that product is really qualitatively better than the other one. So as a buyer, I have incomplete information about the product. And also, as far as the price of the product is concerned, since this market is a local market, so I know what is the price of the product in my local market, but I do not know if this is the optimal price or not. There may be another market, another local market where the good is being sold at a lower price, or contrarily at a higher price. So what I'm saying is I may get a surgery done in Springfield and it may cost me a certain amount of money, but I don't know whether that is the best possible price of that surgery. Maybe if I drive 2 hours down or 3 hours down to Kansas City, maybe I can get that same surgery done at a lower out-of-pocket price. Okay? So the buyers have incomplete information about the quality of the product and the price of the product in case of monopolistic competition, unlike perfect competition. And it is precisely due to this reason, okay, it is precisely due to this reason that this market is also an inefficient market compared to perfect competition. If you remember, we said yesterday that perfect competition is the most perfect one, or it is the most efficient one. All other markets are inefficient compared to perfect competition. So that still holds. Is that clear? So we still have the quantity on the horizontal axis and we are still measuring price, marginal revenue, and the average total cost, that is ATC, on the vertical axis. And just like monopoly, if you remember, I gave you an example yesterday where we were looking at the quantity, we were looking at the price, we were looking at the total revenue, and we were looking at the marginal revenue, right? You had those numbers. That same thing would still hold in case of monopolistic competition. That means if you have a product, as the quantity of the product, as the price of the product increases, the quantity consumed will go down. That means law of demand holds. And the law of diminishing marginal revenue also holds in case of monopolistic competition. And if you remember, I told you yesterday that if those two laws hold, if the law of demand is true in a market, and if the law of diminishing marginal revenue is true in a market, then you have downward sloping demand curve, and you have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve, but that marginal revenue curve is always going to be lower than the demand curve. Mathematically, this will always be true, and I gave you an example yesterday where that was proved. Now, if those two laws get violated, that is the law of demand and the law of diminishing marginal revenue, then this will not be true. Subject to those two laws being true, this is always going to be true. And you know that the marginal cost curve is upward rising, so you still have that, okay. Now, any economic agent, be a producer or a consumer, be it a seller or a buyer, they take their decision according to marginal benefit being equal to marginal cost, right? Here, the benefit is the revenue. Revenue is the benefit. So, you have this point where your marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So, that is the optimal point for these sellers, the monopolistic competition sellers. So, obviously, the quantity decision, that is how much should this market produce, how much should this industry produce, that is determined from that point. MR is equal to MC point. Let us call that Q star. That is the quantity decision, okay, and that is being taken according to MB is equal to MC or MR is equal to MC. But you cannot read the price from here. Price is always read from the demand curve. So, you travel all the way up to the demand curve, and that gives you the optimal price which is set by the monopolistic competition industry, okay. So, you get your quantity decision, you get your price decision, and from the whatever, the total revenue, total revenue is price times quantity. So, in this case, it will be P star times Q star, whatever be the value of P star or Q star, okay. So, we know what is going to be the total revenue, we know what is going to be the price and what is going to be the optimal quantity. But please note that we cannot say anything about the cost. We cannot say anything about the profit unless we know what is the cost of the industry or what is the cost of the seller. To know what is the profit, you need idea about revenue and you need idea about cost, right? Because profit is total revenue minus total cost, remember? So, you need one additional curve. Which curve is that? Exactly. So, you need the average total cost curve, some cost information to decide whether this firm is going to make a profit or a loss, right? Once again, just like your monopoly, the cost curves may be located in three different ways, and I want to remind you that all three possibilities are not happening at the same time. You can either have a cost curve that is higher than the demand curve, something like ATC1, okay. You can have a cost curve that is exactly tangent to the demand curve at P star, something like ATC2, or you can have a cost curve of the firm that is lower. That means it is anywhere between the demand curve or the MR curve or even below the MR curve, okay. So, you can have a cost curve that looks like that. This is exactly the same thing as your monopoly. So far, nothing is different, correct? Let's deal with ATC1 first. I cannot use that part of the board, right? If I draw here, they can still see. Okay, that's good. So I'm just drawing another diagram here, the same diagram. But here I'm just showing something like ATC 1. Okay? So it's higher than the demand curve. So I'm just kind of showing one case over there. Now if you look at ATC 1, it is higher than the demand curve. And if you read from ATC 1, then your price is still P star. But to produce the quantity Q star, now this firm has a cost of C1 star, and I'm reading the cost from the ATC curve, correct? Can you see that? The cost I'm reading from the ATC curve. So this is a situation where the cost, that is C1 star, is greater than the price P star. So just like monopoly, is this going to be a situation of profit, or is it going to be a situation of loss? It's going to be a situation of loss because the cost of production is greater than the price. So they are spending more out of their pocket for producing the good than what they get by selling the good. So this is a situation of loss, and the amount of loss is shown by this shaded area. Okay, that's the amount of loss diagrammatically. In the picture, that is the loss. Okay, C star minus P star. Okay. Now, please note that if there is going to be loss, is this market attractive or unattractive? It's an unattractive market. And remember, unlike monopoly, different from monopoly, now guys can come in, new sellers can come in, and existing sellers can leave the market, right? You have relatively free entry and exit in this market. You just wrote it down. So if this is a loss-making, unattractive market, will people leave or come in? People will leave. Now please try to understand a little carefully. Now things get a little critical. It gets a little hazy. So try to understand. So now what is happening? The number of buyers is still the same, correct? But some of the existing people are leaving, isn't it? So the number of sellers is going down in the market. So the existing people now still have a higher amount of demand. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So earlier you had 100 sellers catering to 100 buyers. Now, due to the loss, some of those sellers are leaving. Let's say 50 sellers leave the market and only 50 stay back. So among now these 50 sellers will be able to get 2 customers each, isn't it? Yes or no? So they are able to command a larger share of the market, assuming that they split the market equally. If they are able to share the market in that way, then you can understand that each seller is experiencing a higher demand. And that is not a change in the actual demand, but it is a change in the perception of the seller. Right? Why am I saying it's not a change in the actual demand? Because none of the demand side conditions are changing. What are the things that can change demand? If you think about it, if you remember a little bit from your demand and supply chapter, it has to be number of buyers, or it has to be income of the buyers, or it has to be the price of the related goods, right? None of that is changing here. So it is not an actual change in demand. But if I am a seller in this market, I am perceiving a change in demand because some of my fellow sellers have left the market. So to me, it seems as if I have a rise in the demand. I have more consumers suddenly to cater to. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes? So for the sellers, there is a perceived change in demand so that this demand curve now moves out like that. But please note, I will not call this D dash. Instead, I will just call it D perceived, because this is not an actual change in demand. Demand side conditions in the market have not changed at all. This is just in the mind of the seller. It's a psychological impact that the seller is feeling. It's a perception. Since some of the fellow sellers have left the market, the existing sellers feel like they suddenly have a rise in the demand. They suddenly have a larger volume of consumers coming to them. Okay? And if that happens, please note that now the price in the market, instead of being P star at the new demand curve, the price has become, let's call it P star dash, isn't it? If you're reading the price from the new demand curve, you're going all the way, quantity is still Q star, but you're going all the way up now to the new demand curve, so that you have a new price which is P star dash, correct? And please note that this P star dash is exactly equal to C1 star. So now the cost and the price are exactly the same. So if price and cost are exactly the same, what do you have in the market? Do you have profit, loss, or break even? It is break even, which means there is zero profit or zero loss. Correct? Can I say something, guys? Like, I've been noticing this for a couple of days. This gets a little distracting. If you guys keep laughing and smiling, I love to see smiling faces, but it gets a little distracting from this side. Okay? Anyways, so from P star dash is equal to C1 star. Okay? So that means that all the loss or the profit in the market gets wiped out and the market breaks even. Okay? So that means in the long run, no matter whether there is loss in the short run, over a longer period of time, since some of the existing sellers will leave the market and that will change the perception of demand by the sellers, you eventually have a break-even solution in the market. Correct? Now please note that even though there is break-even solution in the market, it is zero profit, zero loss in the long run, yet this quantity is less than that cost minimizing quantity, right? It is still less than the cost minimizing quantity, because the cost minimizing quantity has to be at the lowest point of ATC. So this quantity is still not the cost minimizing quantity, unlike perfect competition. So it is still inefficient in that sense. Okay? So please write down the output produced in monopolistic competition is not cost minimizing, hence there is still inefficiency in the market. If I have a similar diagram for the situation like ATC3, I have the exact same diagram. So the price is still from the demand curve, but now I have an ATC curve which lies between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. So something like ATC 2 from the diagram on the left, if I have a situation like that. Okay? So you still have the quantity from the point MR is equal to MC. Corresponding to that quantity, you go all the way up to the demand curve, and you have the price, that is P star. But in this case, the cost is given from ATC2, where this is the cost incurred. Let me call that C2 star. Okay, and you can clearly see that in this case, P star, the price that the seller gets in the market is greater than his cost of production. So that's a good situation for the seller. He can get more money from the market than what he spends out of his pocket. So that's a situation of profit for the seller. And in the diagram, if I had to show you what is the amount of the profit, it would be exactly this rectangle. We don't need to calculate it numerically here in this class. Yes?
I'm getting confused because on that diagram,
Oh, I'm sorry. This is ATC3.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Sorry, ATC3, not ATC2. ATC3. That is, it lies between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. From your diagram on the left, this is something like ATC3, where your ATC lies between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. So that's a situation of profit. So now once again, just like the previous case, if there is profit in the short run, this market is going to be an attractive market for the sellers who are still not in the market, right? So for an attractive market, new guys are going to come in, new sellers are going to enter the market because this is relatively a free entry market. When new sellers come in, so let's say what is happening now. Once again, you have 100 sellers and 100 buyers. Without any change in the number of buyers, let's say another 100 sellers come into the market seeing that this is attractive, right? So what is happening? Now there are 200 sellers but the same 100 buyers. So each seller now basically gets to cater to half a buyer. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So once again, please note that there is no change in the demand side. Nothing has changed in the demand side of the market, so there is no actual change in demand. But due to the entry of new sellers, every seller now experiences a lower perceived demand. It's a perception of the seller in terms of demand, which he thinks that, okay, my demand has now gone down. I have less consumers to cater to. So that will result in a left shift of the demand curve, but I will not call this D dash, but I will call it D perceived once again, because this is a perception, not the actual change in demand. Okay. So for the same quantity, you can see now the price will be read from the new blue demand curve. So the price is now something like P star, let's call that double dash, which is equal to C2 star, isn't it? So once again, that difference between cost and price has gone wiped out, or in other words, the market starts breaking even. There is zero profit, zero loss. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that unlike monopoly, in monopolistic competition, profit or loss does not stay forever. If you have profit, then eventually the market will go towards break even, just like perfect competition. If you have loss, then eventually the market will go towards break even, like perfect competition. But nevertheless, even if it breaks even, the market is not able to produce that cost minimizing quantity. Okay? Now, so that means if I compare, is everything clear here? Do you want any more explanations here? Any questions? Okay. So now if I want to compare between these three markets, perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition. In perfect competition, I have cost minimizing output as well as break even solution, right? So market will break even in the long run. There will be zero profit, zero loss. And at the same time, the quantity that is going to be produced is going to be the cost minimizing quantity in case of perfect competition. Okay? In case of monopoly, it is neither going to be break even, nor is it going to be cost minimizing. So it's not going to be zero profit, zero loss, or it's not going to be the cost minimizing quantity. Okay? And in case of monopolistic competition, you may be able to get a zero profit, zero loss situation. That is, the market may be able to break even, but still it is not able to produce the cost minimizing quantity. Okay. So, the two conditions are satisfied only in case of perfect competition, but only one of them gets satisfied in case of monopolistic competition. In case of monopoly, none are satisfied. So, the monopoly in that sense is the most inefficient market. Please write that down. Monopoly is the most inefficient market compared to perfect competition, because it is neither breaks even nor is the output cost minimizing. Monopoly is the most inefficient market because it neither breaks even nor is the quantity cost minimizing in the long run. Monopolistic competition, point number 2, monopolistic competition is less inefficient than monopoly. Monopolistic competition is less inefficient than monopoly because it breaks even in the long run, but there is inefficiency, because the output is not cost minimizing. Because the output is not cost minimizing. Okay. So, with this we come to end with the discussion of microeconomics in market theory. Okay. And hopefully there will be no more microeconomics this semester, thankfully for you guys. Okay. The remaining will all be discussions on your healthcare field. So, what is the time, guys? 1? 20. Okay, so I have time. You have the weekend, please spend some time on just looking at this, and like I told you, you don't have to spend a lot of time on the diagram, just get the concept right. And I will share Dr. Brown's videos with you, okay, the video links. There will be lot of videos, but they are all like 7-8 minute videos. Okay. If you think there is something that I did not mention and it is getting critical for you to understand, that means that is not required for you. So, you can just ignore that part. Okay. So, whatever you understand in the videos, that is required for you basically. If something is just going tangential, it means it is not required for you. Anyways, now today let me begin a new topic which is about hospital industry. So, now we are talking about different healthcare industries or different healthcare markets, and my plan is to cover 3 markets, that is the hospital market, the physician and the nurses market, or basically the healthcare workforce market, and thirdly the pharmaceutical market. Hopefully we will have time to do the 3. Okay. Now, under hospital industry, the stuff that we are going to cover, first we will do a brief history of hospitals, and I will give you notes, lecture notes on this. Okay. History of hospitals. The second point that we will cover is classification of hospitals. Okay. The fourth point that we will cover is the structure of hospitals. Okay. And it is precisely here when we talk about structure of hospitals, this is where we will need information on that market theory that we just covered, right. So, is a hospital industry, is it perfect competition or is it something different from perfect competition? Is it monopoly? Is it monopolistic competition? What is the structure? Okay. So, here we will need information on market theory. Next, we are going to talk about models of hospital behavior. Models of hospital behavior. Under models of hospital behavior, we are going to talk about two different types of model, and we won't be too mathematical or very theoretical. We will just be very intuitive in those models. One is the utility maximizing model. They cannot see. Utility maximizing model, and the other one is the physician's control model. Okay, and then finally we will talk about some current trends in the industry. Those are the things that we will cover in this particular chapter. Okay. Now coming to the history of hospitals, and we will talk briefly about it in class. When I give you the lecture notes, you will see it in more detail. You can read it in more detail. So the hospital industry in USA, and we are talking about this last century, that is, we are talking about the history of hospitals from 1900, okay, to sometime around, let's say, the current times, okay, till the recent times, what has happened in the hospital industry. So initially, when the hospital industry, when you saw in the very early days, like in the 1900s, till 1910, the hospital industry in USA was very underdeveloped. Underdeveloped in the sense that there was no quality control. There were not too many hospitals as you would imagine in USA. There were no statutory laws for quality control. There were no restrictions as such. So it was a very free industry in that sense. Okay. In the period of actually after 1910, that is when basically the hospital industry started gaining some importance, and it started becoming a little more stringent. Stringent in terms of quality control, stringent in terms of restrictions in the market, okay, and what was responsible for that is a report that was submitted by a committee which is called the Flexner report. Okay, so they evaluated the industry and said that this industry should be given more importance by the government of the country, and there should be some stipulations, mandates or quality control brought into the market. Okay, that's the first thing. Secondly, the next major development that happened was in 1928, okay, when a major nurses reform took place in this country, nursing reform. So before this, 1928, mostly nursing services were offered on a voluntary basis, and there were not too many trained nurses in this country. So there was not much stress on the training and education of nurses. There were no nursing programs as such in the universities. But in 1928, there was a major reform when this started becoming a field where people needed specialized training and people started gaining specialized training. Earlier, nurses were mostly the people who were doing voluntary services, okay? But now they started becoming an important part of the healthcare workforce, okay? And having said that, also after this nursing reform, the nurses stopped being kind of substitutes to hospitals. Earlier, before 1928, before these reforms, the nurses, these voluntary workers, they were somewhat like, substitutes to hospitals. But after the reform, they became a part of the healthcare workforce, but they started working in coordination or in integration to hospitals, or in other words, they kind of became complements to hospitals. Okay? The next major thing happened in the hospital industry with the Second World War. Okay. During Second World War, there was a major thrust on the hospital industry based on creation of new hospitals. So, lot of new hospitals started getting built in USA during the Second World War. The government put in lot of money, lot of revenues were channelized, lot of public expenditure was channelized into building hospitals, and most of these hospitals were built with government subsidies. Okay? Some of them were built with charitable donations from philanthropic organizations, but many of those got built by government funds, and many of these hospitals were actually government owned that got built during that time. Okay? The next major development came in the 1960s, that is mid 1960s. That is when the public health insurance programs were developed, Medicare and Medicaid. Public health insurance programs. The next major development came in 1980s when the hospital industry started becoming, post 1980, it started becoming extremely competitive. So competition was introduced in the hospital industry. Before that, there was not much competition in this industry. So this started becoming like any other market, okay, with competition. And in 1990s, the most striking feature was large-scale spending in the hospital industry, large spending on hospitals. So as there was increase in healthcare cost, similarly at the same time it was observed that there was large spending on hospitals, both, yes, Josh?
Competition with the insurance companies or with the hospital?
Within the hospital industry. We are talking about the hospital industry.
And the large spending, was it by consumers at the hospital?
Both in terms of healthcare cost and also in terms of how much the government was spending. So there was large scale spending in hospitals, both by consumers, that is out of pocket payment for hospitals was increasing, and government was also spending a large share of its budget on healthcare expenditure in general, but more so for hospitals. Why would the government spend, do you think, on hospitals? What is the source of spending for the government? Medicare, right, Medicaid. So the government was paying for Medicaid and Medicare for people who were claiming those insurances by visiting the hospitals, and the government was also spending for construction of hospitals also. Okay, so this became a major part of government expenditure. And please note that while the spending of consumers was increasing just on hospitals, the healthcare expenditure of the country was also increasing at the same time. Okay, so it's not just specifically for hospitals, but in general the healthcare costs of people were rising, and their health and the healthcare costs of the government was rising. Okay, and precisely it is due to this reason, that is due to the escalating healthcare costs both of the government as well as the individual consumers, that reform became necessary at some point, basically the Obamacare. So this kind of led to the healthcare reform that we saw in 2008.